You want to know what it feels like to write a check for $47,000 and then find out your name wasn't even on the seating chart? I do. I was in my kitchen in Decatur, Georgia, the third Saturday in October, measuring out self-rising flour for the biscuits I'd promised to bring to the rehearsal dinner. The window over the sink was fogged up from the pot of collard greens on the back burner. My phone was sitting on the counter, screen up, because my daughter, I'll call her by what she was to me that day, which was my whole heart, had called me 20 minutes earlier, and we'd talked about whether the florist had confirmed the ivory ribbons on the centerpieces. She said she'd call me right back. I said fine. I went back to my flour. The phone never went dark. I didn't realize it at first. I was humming the way I do when I cook. Something old I couldn't name. Then I heard a voice that wasn't my daughter's. It was her mother-in-law. I'll call her what she was, my daughter's future mother-in-law, a woman from Alpharetta who wore her money like a coat she never took off indoors. She said, I just don't see why she has to sit at the family table. She's not exactly the image we're trying to project. I stopped humming. My daughter laughed. It was the small, apologetic laugh she'd had since she was 9 years old, the one she used when she didn't want conflict. She said she'll understand. She's easy. The future mother-in-law said, good, because I already told the venue coordinator she'd be at table 11, near the back. My daughter said, she won't even notice. I set down the measuring cup. I did not cry. I am 63 years old, and I have buried a husband and raised 2 children alone on a teacher's salary in Clayton County, and I have learned that tears are for later when you're in the bathtub and nobody can hear you. What I did right then was reach over and press the red button on my phone. I did it quietly, the way you close a door in a house where someone is finally sleeping. Then I stood at my counter for a long time, looking at the flour. Let me tell you what I had done for that wedding. 18 months earlier, my daughter had called me from her apartment in Buckhead, crying the good kind of crying, saying he proposed at the rooftop restaurant she'd always talked about, and the ring was exactly what she'd shown him on her phone 3 Christmases ago. I cried too. We stayed on the phone for an hour. I told her she deserved every good thing. 6 weeks after that, she told me his parents, her future in-laws, weren't in a position to contribute financially to the wedding. The father had some business reversals. The mother had, as my daughter carefully phrased it, a complicated relationship with budgeting. I said I understood. I said we'd figure it out. What I figured out was this. I cashed out a portion of my teacher's retirement account. Not all of it, but enough that my financial advisor called me twice to make sure I understood the early withdrawal penalties. I understood. I'd been saving that money for 22 years, and I understood every dollar of it. I paid the venue deposit, $14,000 for the estate in Fayetteville with the wraparound porch and the old magnolia in the back. My daughter had cried when she toured it. I wired the money on a Tuesday and did not mention it again. I paid the caterer, $8,000, with a tasting menu that included the shrimp and grits station my daughter had specifically asked for because her late father used to make shrimp and grits on Sunday mornings, and she wanted something of him in the room. I paid the photographer and the videographer as a package deal, $6,200. A woman out of East Point whose work I'd seen at a colleague's daughter's wedding and spent 3 weeks tracking down. I co-signed the contract for the florist. Ivory and sage, my daughter's colors, hydrangeas and eucalyptus, and something called lisianthus that looked like a smaller, softer rose. I bought my daughter's dress, not the first dress she tried, or the second, the third dress. The one she came out of the dressing room in and stood very still in front of the mirror. The one where she didn't say anything, and neither did I, because we both already knew. $3,100. I handed over my Visa card, the way you hand over something you've been saving to give. I arranged the hotel block at the Marriott in Peachtree City for the out-of-town guests. I called the catering manager at the rehearsal dinner venue personally 3 times because they kept getting the dietary restrictions wrong. In 18 months, I spent or committed just over $47,000. I have a spreadsheet. I always have a spreadsheet. My husband used to say I could organize my way out of any disaster. He didn't know about this one. Here is what his family contributed. His mother picked the wedding favors. Small mason jars of local honey from a farm stand in Cherokee County. She presented this contribution at a planning dinner in August, like she was announcing a land acquisition. She said, "I found something that really speaks to the aesthetic. $12 a jar, 40 jars, because I was also quietly covering the cost of those 2 through the general wedding budget I was managing. She did not know that. She still doesn't." His father gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner. It was 9 minutes long and was primarily about his son's high school baseball career. That was the full extent of it. There were signs before the phone call. I want to be honest about that, because I've had enough time now to look at the shape of things clearly. The first sign was the rehearsal dinner seating. His mother had appointed herself the coordinator of that event, even though I was paying the bill at the Italian place in Noonan. She sent a seating chart by email to my daughter, who forwarded it to me, in which I was seated at a foretop near the hallway to the kitchen. His aunts and cousins were at the long center table. My sister, who had driven down from Knoxville, was not on the chart at all. My daughter called to tell me there must have been a mistake. I said I was sure that was right. The second sign was the menu tasting. There was a meeting in September at the estate in Fayetteville with the catering team. I had scheduled it. I had driven 40 minutes to be there. His mother arrived 20 minutes late, made 3 suggestions that would have changed the entire menu, and then told the catering manager in front of me that the primary decision makers would follow up by end of week. She meant herself and my daughter. She did not look at me when she said it. I smiled. I have been smiling over things that cut me for 30 years. I am very good at it. The third sign was something my daughter said in September at a dinner the 2 of us had at the Cracker Barrel on Highway 85, because I'd had a long day and that's where I wanted to go. She said, "His mom has a lot of opinions about how the day should feel." I said, "What does that mean?" She looked at her chicken and dumplings and said, "She wants it to feel elevated." I asked what that meant in practical terms. My daughter said, "She mentioned that some of my family might be," she said, "a lot, like a lot, for the energy she's going for." I didn't say anything. I picked up my sweet tea and I drank it. My daughter said, "You know she doesn't mean anything by it." I said, "Of course." What I didn't say was that I was sitting across from my daughter in a Cracker Barrel I'd brought her to 100 times since she was small enough to need a booster seat, and that a lot meant me, and that I had $47,000 in this wedding, and that I already knew, somewhere in the bottom of my chest, that none of that was going to be enough to make me acceptable to that woman. I didn't say any of that. I ordered peach cobbler for dessert, and we talked about the Honeymoon Hotel in Savannah. After I hung up the phone in my kitchen in Decatur, I did not call my daughter back. I did not call my sister in Knoxville, though she would have had a great deal to say. I did not pray, though I am a praying woman. I stood at my counter until the collard greens started to smell like they needed attention, and I turned the burner down, and I washed my hands. And I sat at my kitchen table where I have sat for 11 years, making every significant decision of my adult life without another person to help me make it. I thought about what I actually controlled. Here is what I controlled. Everything. Every vendor, every contract, every deposit, every payment, every scheduled delivery. My name was on the venue contract. My card was on file with the caterer, the photographer, the florist. I had been the point of contact because my daughter had trusted me to handle it, and I had handled it completely because that is what I do. His mother was in a position of having picked out 40 mason jars of honey. I sat with that for a while. Then I picked up my phone, and I made 3 calls. The first call was to the venue. I asked to speak with the event coordinator, a young woman named, well, I'll leave her out of it. She was kind and professional, and none of this was her business. I told her I needed to speak with her about the October booking. She pulled it up. I told her there had been a change in the financial sponsorship situation, and I needed to understand the cancellation and transfer policy as it related to the primary contract holder. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she explained that as the signatory and depositing party, I had authorization to modify or cancel the contract, with the deposit being non-refundable, but all future payments being released. I said I understood. I asked her to place a hold on the October date pending further communication, which she said she could do for 72 hours. I said that would be fine. I thanked her. She said have a nice evening. The second call was to the caterer. Similar conversation. I had paid a deposit of $2,000 and a progress payment of $3,000. I was the contract holder. The remaining $3,000 was not yet due. I asked them to pause all meal prep and purchasing for the October event, pending a contract review. They said they could do that for 48 hours before they'd need a decision. I said that was fine. The third call was to my daughter. I did not tell her what I'd done. I told her I'd been thinking about the wedding, and I wanted to have breakfast with her the following morning, and could she come to the house? She said, of course, was everything okay? I said, yes, I just wanted to see her face. She said, Mom, you're being weird. I said, I know. I'll see you at 8. She came at 8:15, which is my daughter, always slightly late, always apologetic about it, always bringing something. This time, a bag of those cheddar biscuits from the fast food place on Flat Shoals Road that she knows I have complicated feelings about but will always eat. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee. I did not start with what I knew. I am a retired 4th-grade teacher. I know how to lead up to something. I asked her how she was feeling about the wedding. She said nervous, excited, overwhelmed. I asked if she felt supported. She looked at me over her coffee mug for a moment too long and said yes. I said, baby, you know I would do anything for you. She said she knew that. I said, and you know I have done a great deal for this wedding. She got very still. I said, your phone didn't hang up yesterday. I watched her face do the thing I had been watching her face do her whole life. The quick internal accounting, the deciding which version of the truth to lead with. She put her mug down. She said, Mom? I said, I'm not angry. And I was surprised to find that was true. I was not angry in the hot way. I was sad in the cold way, which is quieter and goes much deeper. I said, I need you to tell me honestly. Did you know she was going to put me at table 11? She didn't answer. That was its own answer. I said, did you agree to it? She said, I didn't want to make it a whole thing. I said, I see. She said she has strong feelings about the day, and she stopped. She looked at her hands. I just wanted everything to be smooth. I said, and me asking for a seat at the family table at my only daughter's wedding would not have been smooth. She said very quietly, she made it clear that there were certain expectations. I said, I know she did. I heard her. My daughter's eyes filled. She said, I'm so sorry, Mom. I said, I believe you. And then I told her about the 3 calls. There was a period of about 10 minutes that I will not describe in full because it belongs to my daughter and not to this story. What I will say is that she cried. What I will say is that I handed her a box of Kleenex and waited. What I will say is that I did not comfort her the way I have comforted her since she was an infant, which is to pull her close and absorb it. I let her feel it from across the table because some things need to be felt from a distance to be understood. When she stopped crying, she said, "What does this mean for the wedding?" I said, "That depends entirely on what you decide the wedding means." She said, "I love him." I said, "I know you do. This isn't about him." She was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The cheddar biscuits were getting cold on the table between us. She said, "If I tell her that things need to change," I said, "that's your choice to make." She said she'll make everything difficult. I said, "Yes, she probably will." She said, "What would you do?" I said, "I wouldn't have let it get here." "But that's not useful to you now." She looked at me. She said, "You're not going to make this easier, are you?" I said, "No, baby. That's the one thing I can't do for you anymore." What happened next happened over 4 days, and I was not present for most of it. My daughter called her fiancé. I know this because he called me, and this is the part I did not expect. He called me himself from his car in a parking garage in Midtown, and he said, "Ms. Mees." And then he stopped and started again and said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You don't need to." He said, "I knew things were going sideways and I let it happen because it was easier." I'm not that person. I don't want to be that person. I said, "What do you want to do about it?" He said, "I want to marry your daughter and I want you at the family table and I want my mother to understand that this is not negotiable." I said, "Then you need to say that clearly." He said, "I know. I don't know exactly what he said to his mother. What I know is that she called me 2 days later. She was not warm. She was not apologetic in any way I would call genuine. She said things like, 'I may have been unclear about my intentions, and I hope we can find common ground going forward.' It was the language of someone who had been told to make a call, not someone who wanted to make it. I said the things you say in that situation. I was polite. I am always polite. What I also knew by then was that my daughter had had a longer and harder conversation with her fiancé about who controlled the shape of their marriage, and that conversation had not been comfortable for anyone, and that it was the most necessary thing that had happened in the 18 months of planning. I called the venue back and reinstated the contract. I called the caterer. I called nobody else because nobody else needed to know. The wedding happened on the 3rd Saturday in October, and the magnolia tree in the back of the estate in Fayetteville had gone just barely gold at the tips of its leaves, which is a thing I had not planned and could not have paid for. I sat at the family table. His mother sat at the family table too. We were not warm. We were not enemies. We were 2 women who understood each other's leverage clearly and had decided that a Saturday in October was not the place to spend it. I wore a navy dress I'd had altered twice because I wanted it to sit exactly right, and I had my hair done the morning of at the salon on Panthersville Road, where Ms. Eunice has been doing my hair for 16 years, and I looked, if I say so myself, like a woman who had earned her seat. My daughter walked down the aisle on her own, the way she had asked to, because she said she was walking toward something, not being handed off. I sat in the front row and watched her go and thought about her father, who would have been 67 that month, and about the shrimp and grit station with the little tent card that read, "In memory of a Sunday tradition," which I had arranged without telling her. She saw it when she came through the reception line. She held on to my arm for a moment and didn't say anything, just held on. That was enough. That was more than enough. Here is the thing about $47,000 that nobody tells you. It was never really about the money. Money was just the shape that my love had taken for 18 months, the way love does when you're the one who shows up and handles it and makes the calls and measures the flour and drives 40 minutes to a tasting you didn't need to attend. Money was the envelope. What was inside it was something else. What I wanted was to be seen, not thanked. I have lived long enough to know that gratitude is complicated and imperfect and often late, not honored, not put on a pedestal or given a speech, just seen. Just she's here. She made this possible. She matters, give her a seat at the table where the people who matter sit. That's all. And I almost didn't get it. Not because my daughter didn't love me. She does, in the deep, unreasonable way that I love her. The way that makes you do things like cash out your retirement account without being asked. But because love without a spine will let you be put at table 11 and call it keeping the peace. She's still learning. They both are. But on the third Saturday in October in Fayetteville, Georgia, under a magnolia that had gone gold at the tips, my daughter married a man who called me from a parking garage because he didn't want to be the person who let it happen. I thought about that on the drive home, while the radio played something I didn't know but liked anyway. The collard greens are still good reheated, I thought. I'll have them for dinner. Some things you can still save. I've had people ask me, after hearing a story like this, whether I regret any of it. The money, the months, the energy I poured into a day that almost erased me from its own guest list. And I have to sit with that question honestly, because it deserves more than a quick answer. I don't regret the $47,000. I regret that I spent 18 months making myself smaller so that nobody would be uncomfortable. That's the thing I'd change if I could go back. Not the checks I wrote, but the silence I kept every time I felt something wasn't right and smiled over it anyway. The rehearsal dinner seating chart, the word elevated. The dinner at the Cracker Barrel, where my daughter stared at her chicken and dumplings and I picked up my sweet tea and said nothing. Silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just the shape that fear takes when you've spent a lifetime trying not to be too much for people. Here's what I've come to understand sitting on the other side of it. What you allow is what continues. That's not a punishment. That's just how human dynamics work. When you absorb something without naming it, you teach the people around you that it's acceptable. My daughter didn't become someone who let her mother get seated at table 11 because she was a bad person. She became that person incrementally, one small accommodation at a time, because I had never shown her what it looked like to hold a line. I had shown her what it looked like to be gracious under pressure. There's a difference between the two, and I had confused them for years. What changed things wasn't the money. It was the decision to stop pretending I hadn't heard what I heard. Moral courage isn't a dramatic thing most of the time. It doesn't announce itself. It's quieter. It's the moment you choose not to smooth something over when everything in you wants to, because you know that the smoothing is costing you something real. My daughter's fiancé called me from a parking garage because he had that same moment. He could have let it go. It would have been so much easier. But he decided he didn't want to be the kind of man who lets things go that shouldn't be let go, and that decision, that single act of integrity when nobody was watching, and the easier path was right there. That's the thing that told me my daughter had chosen well. You find out who people are not when things are easy, but when it costs them something to do right. That's always been true. It'll keep being true long after the flowers from that October wedding have dried out and crumbled. I went home that night and ate my collard greens and thought about my husband, who used to say that the people who love you correctly will always make space for you at the table. He meant it small. Dinner, family gatherings, ordinary Sundays. But I think he was right about it in every sense. The people who love you correctly will fight for your seat. And if they won't, the most honest and loving thing you can do, for them and for yourself, is to stop setting your own place in the back and quietly let them understand what it is they're about to lose. That's what those 3 phone calls were. Not revenge, a mirror.